course, shaping the way we teach English. Webinar Wednesday.
Welcome to Shaping the Way We Teach English Webinar Course 15, brought to you by the American English team. My name is Jennifer Hodgson, part of the American English team based in Washington, D.C. I would like to know, are there any teachers here who have participated in any of our previous webinars? Please raise your hand. You can raise your hand by clicking on the little man in the center of the screen. Oh wow, I see so many returning webinar lovers. Okay, so you can also put your hand down by clicking on the little man again. So I want to give a big welcome to all of our teachers who have joined us before, and a very warm welcome to all the new teachers joining us for the first time. Here you can see the schedule for Course 15. We have a lot of exciting topics coming up, today being just the first one of this course. During these webinars, you will hear but not see the presenter, and the way for you to participate is by using the chat box, as you are already doing. This is where you can ask questions or make comments related to today's topic. You will also see myself, moderator Jenny, and moderator Heather, and moderator Tony. Say hi, guys. They'll be in the chat box too to help, but we also rely on the webinar community to help each other. We won't be able to answer every question during today's session because there are hundreds of teachers participating, but there is another place for you to ask questions after the webinar is over. Also, your presenter may ask you questions in the form of polls. These will be multiple choice questions that will appear on your screen. We know that some people may experience technical difficulties, and unfortunately we cannot fix each individual issue, but we will let you know if we're having a global problem. If you do lose sound, a great way to follow along is in the caption pod that you can see at the bottom of the screen. Webinar courses consist of 6 webinars. During the course, they take place every other Wednesday. Participants who attend at least 4 out of 6 webinars receive an e-certificate from the Regional English Language Officer or local U.S. Embassy. If you have certificate questions or issues, they must be addressed with the Relo or Embassy, as we do not issue them here from D.C. To ensure you are eligible for the e-certificate, we ask that you submit your attendance at the very end of the webinar. Please do not submit it before, or it will not be counted. And for individuals, meaning that you are watching this webinar on your own computer alone, you just need to write your email address at the very end. If you are with a group, so many teachers are watching this webinar together in one place, then the viewing host needs to submit their email address plus just the number of participants in the group. We know that many of you are already familiar with our Ning site, but if you haven't registered yet, please do join the site. Here you can find resources and discussion questions related to each webinar, and this is also where you can ask the presenter questions afterwards. On the Ning, we also post pre-readings and resources, the presentations and recordings after each webinar, so you can go back and actually watch it again or look at the PowerPoint. So please join this site if you haven't already. And finally, we have lots of additional resources that are great for both teachers and your learners. If you have a basic mobile phone, so a phone that looks like the one on the screen, you can download our AE app and have lots of free content on your phone. Please also like us on Facebook if you haven't already. We post resources for teachers every day. And finally, on our YouTube channel, we have lots of useful teacher training videos and recordings of the webinars. Raise your hand if you've ever visited the American English website. Well, if you haven't had a chance to visit our website, I encourage you to visit americanenglish.state.gov, where we have tons of free downloadable resources that are ready to use in your classrooms. So welcome again to today's webinar, Lesson Planning 101, Mapping Activities for a Clear Path to Learning. We never go to a new place without knowing directions or having a map. So why would we enter a new learning experience with our students without knowing where we're taking them? In this webinar, participants will learn to create roadmap classroom activities, starting with the final destination or learning objective in mind. You'll get tools and techniques for keeping yourself and your students focused on achieving goals and maximizing effort for higher levels of learning. Our presenter today is Katie Bain, and she's been an English for Speakers of Other Languages educator for 12 years. She's taught all ages and levels from pre-K to adults, beginner to advanced, mostly in Baltimore in the U.S. From 2012 to 14, she was an English language fellow in Columbia, where she worked with educational and government institutions to promote English teaching around the country. Katie is currently the English Language Programs Coordinator at Georgetown University, and she received her bachelor's degree from Northwestern College in St. Paul, Minnesota in ESL education, and her master's degree in reading education from Towson University in Maryland. Katie enjoys live music, being outdoors, dancing, trying out. Hello, everybody. Good morning or good afternoon or good evening to you, wherever you may be, and happy 2015. Thanks so much for joining us today. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thanks for the great introduction, Jenny. Also, thanks for the instructions for everyone on how to use the response tools to interact with me and your colleagues from around the world by answering poll questions, responding in the chat box, and raising your hand. I also encourage everyone to get a paper and pencil ready to jot down ideas, to take some notes, or to get ready to respond to certain questions in the chat box. Thanks so much for responding to the polls before the webinar. I can see that we have a varied audience here today with all levels of training and experience, so I'm really excited to be here with you. We're going back to the basics today with the topic of lesson planning. Many of you have already had extensive training and experience on this topic, so I hope that you feel refreshed in knowledge and excited for the opportunity to reflect on your practice today. For those of you who haven't had as much training with lesson planning, I hope that this webinar gives you the opportunity to gain new ideas and insights from our discussion and from your colleagues. Thanks for joining us. Now let's get started. Here are our objectives for this webinar. Number 1, participants will learn to create a roadmap of classroom activities, starting with the final destination or learning objective in mind. The second objective is participants will get tools and techniques for getting students to be focused and motivated. On the Ning prior to this webinar, and even today, many folks shared thoughts about how important it is for students to be motivated and focused through proper planning and a good selection and use of learning materials. Thanks for all the discussion on the Ning, and feel free to go there after this webinar as well. This webinar will be more focused on how to implement a lesson rather than on what materials to select, but be sure to check out the American English website for great information on using authentic materials in the classroom every day. So let's focus on creating a roadmap for classroom activities. Take a look at this picture. Please raise your hand if your students have ever looked like this. And be honest. My students don't look like this every day, thank goodness, but I have to admit that there have been a few times when they have. And I see a lot of you responding exactly, sometimes. Take a look at this picture. Have you ever felt like this as a teacher because your students are misbehaving or you are not able to cover all your content material on time? If so, please raise your hand. And again, be honest. I'm thankful that as a teacher, I don't feel like this every day, but there have definitely been some times that I have felt like this because of all the demands placed on teachers. From student levels to curriculum guidelines, it can be stressful trying to work through each responsibility. So, if you raised your hand for either or both of those questions, perhaps you are suffering from a lack of poor lesson planning, and that's what this webinar is going to address today. So now we're going to go to the polls for a few minutes. I'm going to read a few statements about lesson planning, and I'd like you to reflect on whether or not you agree or disagree with each of the statements, or if you feel that they are true or false for your personal experience. You will see an option corresponding with the statements where you can agree or disagree, as you can see right there. And if you are watching this webinar as part of a viewing session, perhaps the host can respond with what the majority of the viewers believe. So let's go ahead and don't forget to be honest. Here's our first statement. I see a lot of you have responded already. I write a lesson plan every single day. This was also a discussion prompt on the Ning. So do you agree or disagree? Looks like about 55% of us agree and about 45% disagree. All right, let's go to the next one. Our second statement is this. Our students suffer when we fail to appropriately plan for them. Do you agree or disagree? And also you might want to think about or write about why this is true or untrue, or even partially true. Looks like the polls say that most of us agree with this statement that our students might suffer when we don't plan for them. Let's go to the next one. Number 3, do you agree or disagree? Nothing ever goes according to my plan, so I don't write lesson plans. What do you think? Sometimes it's easy to give up on lesson planning when distractions interfere with our plans or when our students do not grasp a skill or concept as quickly as we expected or much more quickly than we expected. But it looks like most of you disagree that you still go ahead and write lesson plans even though a lot of times they don't, our plans are not carried out perfectly step by step. Let's go to the next one. The fourth statement is, lesson planning is less important than my other responsibilities, like grading. What do you think? This one's a tricky one because there are so many responsibilities with teaching that it can be difficult to prioritize everything that we want to do. But it looks like most of you disagree that you think that lesson planning is about as important as other responsibilities or maybe even more. Okay, we're ready for our final statement. The final agree or disagree statement is this. I know how to write an organized and effective lesson plan. This question might have to do with how much training or experience you have in the field of teaching and how strongly you feel in your ability to write an excellent plan. So it looks like about 70% of us feel really strongly that we can write an organized and effective plan, and 30% not as much. All right. So thank you for participating in the agree-disagree polls. I think that we all know each other a little bit better and have begun considering some important aspects of lesson planning. So now, take some time to respond in the chat box to this question. What is the purpose of a lesson plan? You might want to write your ideas down before writing in the chat box, or if you're in a viewing session, you might want to take just 1 minute to brainstorm as a group what the purpose of a lesson plan is, and then have your host or moderator write a brief statement in the chat box to summarize your group's ideas about this. So go ahead and write your response in the chat box. All right, I see Ahmed from Kuwait says it is helpful to know how to achieve the objectives. Luis from Colombia, as you said, it is the roadmap. Excellent. Anna from Peru says it gives you direction. Thank you so much. And Elizabeth from Ecuador says to organize activities. Murat from Turkey says to monitor the learning of the pupils. Excellent ideas, everybody. I think we're all on the same page. So let's continue. We're off to a great start for this webinar. Now I'd like to show you the outline for the rest of this webinar. As you can see from this slide, first we'll talk about the background of a lesson plan. What do you need to know or consider when creating a lesson plan? Then we'll discuss the components or essential parts of a lesson plan. Third, we'll examine objectives and have some time to practice evaluating and writing objectives. Fourth, we will discuss assessment in order to answer the question, how do you assess your students on the lesson objective? After that, we'll discuss how to order events in a lesson plan to best help students to achieve the objective. And finally, we'll discuss the important practice of reflecting on our learning, considering how to evaluate ourselves and make sure that our lesson plans are always improving. So let's get started with the background information necessary for lesson planning. We need to know our students, our content, and our resources. In the next few slides, I'll discuss each of those in more detail. First of all, you need to know your students. This type of knowledge can be gained within the first few days of class. Play get-to-know-you games with your students. Ask them to create personal projects or posters about their hobbies, families, and interests. Perhaps on the first day of class, you could give students a diagnostic test or ask them to give you a writing sample. You could give each student a short survey. These tools could all help you to understand the important pieces of each student that make him or her unique and that will help you to create lesson plans tailored to your students' specific needs. Next, you need to know your content. Make sure you are very familiar with your curriculum guides, textbook materials, and that you are always educating yourself in the English language so that you are able to clearly explain those grammar rules to curious students. Whether English is your native language or your fifth or sixth language, it's always important to keep yourself fresh with English communication. Attending this webinar is one way to do that, so great job. Staying on the topic of knowing your content for a few minutes, I wanted to take a minute to discuss how important it is when lesson planning to recognize both the forest and the trees. There's an expression in English you may have heard before, don't miss the forest for the trees. This means that one shouldn't be so focused on small details or the day-to-day tasks that he or she misses the big picture or the big goals that they are trying to help students achieve. Perhaps you want students to develop a love of learning English or to gain a new understanding and appreciation for other cultures. Perhaps you want your students to be able to attend an English-speaking university. Perhaps you want your students to be able to succeed in communicating with tourists in a growing tourism industry in your community. There are so many important big picture ideas that we don't want to neglect when we're thinking about writing lesson plans. You never want to lose sight of those. Here are some suggestions for places where you can find forest or big picture level resources. Make sure you're in touch and communication with your administrators to truly know about your national and school level curriculum resources, and check out the tables of content in textbook resources. Even if you don't have a complete set, tables of contents can be found online and might give you an idea of how to order topics and language points. Of course, it's always important to remember how your colleagues can be amazing resources for you. So always be considering your colleagues and asking questions about what other people are doing and what goals they have for their students. Finally, you need to be familiar with the resources you have available. What do you have? What's available to you? And my favorite question, what can you get for free? Get connected to those who might have access to things that will help your students to learn. And don't forget about the important resource of time, and always consider how your big picture and smaller scope goals can be met within the time frame you have with your students. All right. Now we're ready to discuss the components of a lesson plan. So in the following slides, I'll discuss all the major points that should be included on a written down lesson plan, and I will show you some templates from the Shaping the Way We Teach resource team. You need to include general information, objectives, materials, the procedure, and your assessment plan. Here's a template for your lesson plan. Don't worry about writing all of this down right now, because after today you will be able to access this presentation on the Ning, where you can use the presentation document as a reminder for all you have learned. And this template will also be posted on the resources page for this webinar, so you can access it at any time and use it or modify it to make your own lesson plans. As you can see here, the top part is the general information. This includes the date, the name of your course or class, your institution or school, the amount of time for the lesson, and all those types of things. Below that, you can see the class objective, which is where you can write the goal or target for your lesson. And then finally, you have the procedure section, where you can write the time that you expect each step in your lesson plan to take. So we will discuss ordering activities and writing the specific steps of a lesson plan down a bit later, but I think it's really helpful to write down how much time I'm expecting each activity to take, especially if I'm new to the school or if it's a brand new semester and I'm new to those students. But we're going to be talking about pacing and ordering events a little bit later on. On this half of the lesson plan template, you can see that there is a space to write down the assessment tool that you will use, and a space for lesson evaluation or reflection when you are finished with the lesson. If you already use a great lesson plan template that works well for you, keep using that. If not, consider using something similar to this one. A good lesson plan template can help you remember all of the important aspects of a lesson plan that need to be put into place. You can find one online, use or adapt the one given in this presentation, or create your own. So now we're going to discuss each of these components in a little further detail. So general information is very important to keep in mind when writing a lesson. This includes many of the things we discussed in the background information for a lesson. So all of these things are pretty straightforward: the date, the class, the student level. A unit is a topic or subject that you are currently studying in class for maybe 1 or 2 weeks. For example, maybe you're focusing on the community, vocabulary and conversation related to that topic. That would be the community unit. And of course, you can write down the lesson title and the length of the class. The objective, otherwise known as the target, goal, or aim, is an essential part of any lesson. As the slide says here, the objective helps you to determine what you want the students to know and be able to do by the end of the lesson. You want to make every day's lesson objective measurable and specific. Make sure you don't keep it a secret from your students. Before the lesson gets completely underway, make sure that you tell your students what the focus of the lesson will be. We are going to talk about this a little bit more later, so don't worry. We are going to go back to it in a few minutes. So for your materials, you want to make sure that you assemble and organize all of your materials ahead of time so that you have organized and ready materials so that your transitions flow as the lesson progresses. And then you need to write down, of course, your procedure. How will you bring students to master the objective in an organized and logical way? Keep that objective in mind all along the way and write down the timing you anticipate for each activity until, of course, you have mastered the very difficult art of lesson pacing. There will be more on this topic a little bit later as well. And finally, you need to plan for your assessment. You want to answer the question, how do I know that students have achieved my objective? You need to provide some sort of activity in every lesson that gives you an idea of whether the objective has been met by your students. So there's more on this topic later also, so don't worry. I know I breezed through a lot of these things, but I'm going to come back to a lot of them. All right, so let's go to the polls again, but this time with a multiple choice question. So please respond to the poll as you did before, choosing one answer that's correct in your opinion. So I've briefly discussed all of the components of a lesson plan, but in your opinion, what's the most important part of a lesson plan? The general information, the objective, materials, procedure, or assessment. Okay, it looks like a majority of people agree with me that the objective is the most important part of the lesson plan. So let's go away from the polls. Thank you so much for participating in that. And we'll take a look at my opinion. So it's a little bit of a trick question because I asked for only one answer, but then I got to give two. It's not really fair. But what I think are the two most important components are the objective and the assessment. I think these two things are a power duo. So they can't really be separated, and they spell out for our learners exactly where they are supposed to end up by the end of the lesson. The end destination is the most important part of creating our roadmap to learning, and of course, without knowing where we're going, we won't be able to take the steps to get there. So now, as promised, we will go back to a more in-depth discussion of objectives, what they are, and how we can write the best objectives possible. Let's go to the chat box again. So here's a question for you. What's your opinion? Why should we write objectives? Please respond in the chat box. To have a guide, Lita from Nicaragua, thank you. To know where to go, Alma from Mexico, thank you. Because you need a direction, Luis from Brazil. To make sure that all our activities are related to our objective. To know what you want students to do, to have a destination. Wow, there are so many great responses in the chat box that I don't even think I can read all of them. But I think basically to have a clear idea of where we should get. Awesome, excellent. I think we're all on the same page here. My answer is, as you may have guessed from earlier conversation, to create an endpoint or destination for learning. All right. So in the next few slides, let's go to the polls. So we talked a bit in the chat box, and now let's go to the polls. I want to ask you, who do you think we write objectives for? Do we write them for administrators and supervisors, ourselves as teachers, the students, all of the above, or none of the above? What do you think? Who are objectives written for? Okay, it looks like we have a pretty close race here. Looks like a lot of us think we are writing them for the students, and some for everybody. So let's go back to the slides. In my opinion, we should be writing objectives for D, all of the above. Your administrators and supervisors need to see your objectives so that they can clearly see how you are guiding your students through learning every day. You, the teacher, need to help yourself to focus on each day's goal so that you have a clear target for the end of the lesson. And then I think I would agree with you guys that probably the most important people to write objectives for are our lovely students. because they need to understand where they're headed and be focused and motivated to understand the purpose of their learning. All right, so in the next few slides, we're going to evaluate goals and objectives. First, we'll start with some general goals that really don't have a lot to do with a language classroom, and we'll consider whether these are effective goals or not based on a few important questions. So you're going to be able to choose poll style between two different goals for each one, number 1 and number 2. So let's take a look at our first goal. For these two goals, which one is clearer and more specific? Please respond to the poll. You can write goal 1, goal 2, or I'm not sure. For both of the goals, the question is, what will your life be like in 5 years? For number 1, the response is, I will be rich. For number 2, the response is, I will have worked at this company for 5 years and will have bought a car. So which of these two goals is more clear and specific? Exactly. Almost 99% of you say number 2. We can much more clearly see this person's life in 5 years, whereas in the first one, the goal is very broad and difficult to imagine or to see clearly exactly what the person has in mind. Let's move to our second goal. For the second goal, we're moving to a discussion of fitness goals. So many of us have just celebrated the new year, and with that, many people make fitness resolutions and goals. In this conversation, the question is, what are your fitness goals? The first response is, I will lose 10 kilos in 4 months by exercising every day and eating healthy foods. The second response is, I will lose a lot of weight and have great muscles. So, which of these goals is more measurable? Which one can we actually measure the progress of? Oh my gosh, excellent, 100%. Everybody says, oh, okay, let's go back. Let's look at which one is more measurable. Which one can we see really clearly? I think a lot of us are saying goal 2 we can see a little bit more clearly, and some of us are saying goal 1. I would probably say goal number 1 for this one. This one has a number. It says 10 kilos. It has a method, and it has an amount of time in which we're going to do this. So I think this one is a little bit more measurable. Let's go to our final goal. For these two goals, consider which one is more attainable. By attainable, I mean realistic or doable given the time and resource limitations that you have and the level at which the students are when they first come into your classroom. We always need to set our expectations high, but we have to take steps to get to those high goals. So let's take a look at these two. The question for both is, what is your running plan as a brand new runner? So imagine that someone wanted to start out exercising and running more often. Here are the two goals. The first one is, I am going to run a marathon next week. The second one is, I am going to train to run 5 kilometers within 3 months. Which goal is more attainable for a brand new runner, someone who has never run long distances before? Obviously, yes, the more realistic one, as you guys agree, is the second one. I am going to train to run 5 kilometers within 3 months. A marathon is a great goal and one that can definitely be accomplished for someone who works hard and trains well for a long time, but a more realistic goal is for a person to start with a shorter distance and work towards that longer distance over time. All right, thank you so much for your answers to the polls. So you always want to keep those questions in mind when writing objectives. Is it clear and specific? Is it measurable? And is it attainable? So we are going to go to the polls again in just a minute, and we're going to analyze a few objectives in the next several slides. we are going to consider the question, how do we know if an objective is effective? And we're going to answer the questions, is it clear, is it measurable, and is it attainable? We're going to go back to the polls for this one. So for each objective presented, for each question that receives a yes, you can mark that spot. You can just click a check. And for the ones that you think the answer is no, you don't need to check anything. So for these, on the check boxes, you can check all 3, you can check 0, you can check 1 or 2. So as many as you think the answer is yes to. Okay? All right. So the first objective reads, students will be able to use the present perfect tense by playing a game called Two Truths and a Lie, writing and saying 3 sentences in the present perfect tense. Have you played this game before? It's a nice get-to-know-you game that I encourage you to research and use in your classroom, but we're just going to focus on this as an objective or goal for a language lesson. So let's see your answers here in the polls. Looks pretty good. I forgot to mention beforehand, we are going to be considering for these objectives that we have about 35 students in our classroom and 1 hour of time. Okay, so let's just imagine that we have 35 students and 1 hour of class time. And for the rest of the questions, just put your own context and your own situation as you're thinking about those questions. So is it clear and specific? Yes, I think so, and so do you guys, 94% of you. So this objective is focused on using the present perfect tense by having each student write 3 sentences, 1 that is not true and 2 that are true. So I'd say yes, it's pretty clear. We can see exactly what we want our students to do. Is it measurable? About 40. So remember, you can respond to as many of these questions as you want to. Whatever questions you think can be answered with yes, you can check. For measurable, I actually think that the answer to that is also yes. We have a clear number of sentences. We have 3 sentences that are supposed to be written in the present perfect tense. And as a teacher, I could measure whether a student wrote these sentences correctly or spoke them correctly. And finally, is it attainable? So as I said before, we're thinking about having 35 students in 1 hour. I think it's probably enough time for them to write the 3 sentences, especially if we've already talked about that grammar concept. And if we break the students into 3 groups, we should be able to give them time to talk about their sentences and to present their sentences for the game. All right, let's look at the next objective. The second one reads, students will practice new vocabulary about the classroom. So let's think about this one. What do you think? Is it clear? Many of you think that yes, this one is clear, about 75% of you. I think this is somewhat clear, although it doesn't include any specific vocabulary words. It is clear in that it is focused on one topic, the classroom, but it is not so clear with any method for learning those words or how many words or which words students are supposed to learn. So I'd say it's somewhat clear, sort of. Is it measurable? What do you think? Only about 24% of you think it's measurable. I don't think this objective is very measurable either. We don't have a number to indicate how many words students will be able to understand or use. We don't have a method or process by which students will achieve this objective. So I don't think that every objective needs to have a specific number included in order for it to be a good objective. Sometimes it's beneficial, other times it doesn't make sense. But for an objective to be measurable by the end of the lesson, a teacher needs to be able to examine what was done and know whether what she intended for the lesson was attained or not. And the final question, is it attainable? Well, I think I agree with you guys on this one as well. Because this objective is not very measurable, it's difficult to answer this question. We're not sure how they're going to learn these vocabulary words, so we don't know what they are supposed to attain. I'd say that we can't really answer this question. A way to improve this objective might be, we could say they will learn vocabulary by labeling a classroom picture with 10 classroom objects, or by writing a paragraph with 5 classroom vocabulary words in it. All right, let's take a look at the next objective. Number 3, students will write paragraphs about what they did on their summer vacation. Okay, what do you think? Is this objective clear? I think it's fairly clear, and it looks like you guys do too. We know that students will be writing 1 paragraph about the topic of their summer vacation. Is it measurable? This is somewhat measurable in that it asks for 1 paragraph, but we don't know of a specific skill that the teacher might be trying to test, like a grammar target point or a certain set of vocabulary or the ability to write a topic sentence, that sort of thing. So how about the last question? Is it attainable? For 35 students in 1 hour, I'm not sure. This should be attainable, but it depends, right? If these students have already had a lot of practice with writing paragraphs and needed little support, this could be doable within an hour, but we probably need to add some pre-writing activities beforehand. We may need to teach about the structure of a paragraph, and then we might need to give some time at the end for peer review. So when considering all of those factors, this seems like it might take longer than 1 hour for 35 students. And of course, writing a paragraph would depend on the student's level. All right, so let's look at the next one. Objective number 4, students will show understanding of past tense verbs by writing and saying 3 past tense verbs in a dialogue. What do you think? Is this clear? Yes, I would say it's quite clear. The only thing we don't know is whether these past tense verbs are regular or irregular. Is it measurable? About 52% of you guys think yes, it is measurable. Oh, looks like 67. I think it's quite measurable. We know that we're looking for 3 past tense verbs. We're not sure how long the dialogue needs to be, but that might be clarified further in the assignment guidelines. And is it attainable? About 50% of you, almost 50% of you think so. I think I'm about in agreement with you guys. It's almost attainable. I think we'd probably need an additional day or 2 of class to complete everything necessary so that students could write, edit, and present their dialogues. And of course, this would be assuming that students had already had experience with writing and performing dialogues, and that they had already practiced using some past tense verbs. Okay, you guys have done an amazing job. Let's do our last objective, number 5. Students will demonstrate effective writing skills by writing a compare-contrast essay with an introduction, body, and conclusion. Okay, so is this clear? I agree with you guys. I think it's fairly clear. This is obviously an objective for a higher level class. We don't know how many words, paragraphs, or pages the teacher is requiring, but we know the type of essay being asked for and that possibly the teacher wants to assess the skills of writing a clear intro, body, and conclusion. We don't know what topic the students are supposed to compare and contrast, but that's okay. Is it measurable? About 54% of you guys think yes. I think it's fairly measurable, although hopefully there will be more assignment guidelines. And is it attainable? For 35 students to write a compare-contrast essay in 1 hour, I think it really depends, right? It depends on the group of students, what level they are, but probably it would not be doable in only 1 hour. I think there would need to be extensive pre-writing, maybe some research beforehand. So I think this would be more of an ongoing project that the teacher would have to provide clear steps and guidance for. Okay, so great job on evaluating all of those objectives. Thanks so much for your participation. So now I'd like to give you the opportunity to write an effective objective, keeping those 3 questions in mind and trying to answer yes for all 3. Is it clear? Is it measurable? Is it attainable? So, just a second. We're going to take a look in a minute on the next slide and look at several topics. You will choose one and then write an objective that is clear, measurable, and attainable. I would suggest that you first write your objective on a piece of paper and then type it into the chat box or ask your viewing host to type it into the chat box. So before you write anything, let's look at the topics here. So we have lots of topics here, and you can choose any other topic you would like to. Classroom vocabulary, cultural celebrations, grammar, essay writing, reading comprehension, animals, food, and holidays. You can pick one from here or any other topic that is relevant for your classroom. So now get ready to write your objective first on a piece of paper that you have with you, and on your marks, get set, write. You can now write your objective in the chat box, and we will be able to see your objective and think about whether it's clear, measurable, and attainable. Here are the topics for you. So I see a lot of people choosing excellent topics, holidays, past tense, that sort of thing. So now I want you to think of an objective. I see one, write 3 things you did on your holiday. Excellent. Name 5 animals you can find on a farm. Great. Students will be able to ask and answer questions about personal information. Excellent. Students will write an introduction to the argumentative essay. Excellent. Students will be able to learn new vocabulary, especially adjectives describing food. Wow, you guys are doing awesome. So many excellent objectives that I'm probably not going to be able to read all of them. Students will be able to use the verb to be, name 3 animals, and put them in sentences. Excellent. Very good job, everybody. Like I said, there are so many that are here that I don't even have time to read all of them. You can share them on the Ning if you'd like to, and you can evaluate your objectives and other people's objectives to check for those 3 questions. Okay, so everyone, great job again on writing and analyzing those objectives. Now you should be all set for writing those so that you have a clear destination for your lesson plan in mind before you get started. So now we're going to discuss assessments, which should always be tied directly to your lesson objectives. We're spending so much time today on objectives and assessments because we always want to start with the final destination in mind. The objective plus the assessment of each lesson equals the final destination. Once those are set into place, we can create the steps necessary to guide our students to achieve success in both of those areas. So as stated here, assessment happens throughout the lesson and at the end. As teachers, we are constantly assessing our students throughout the lesson to check for comprehension and acquisition of skills. We just want to make sure that we are clearly and intentionally measuring student learning in the best way possible to meet student learning needs. So let's go to the polls again. Have you used any of these as an assessment at the end of a lesson? So another way of saying assessment is the word evidence, right? As teachers, we always need evidence or proof that our students are learning what we set out to teach them. So on this poll, you can check all that apply or as many as you have used in your classroom. If you haven't heard of 1 or 2 of these options, don't worry, because I'm going to explain exit slips and rubrics in more detail in the next few slides. So the options for your selection are exit slips, verbal responses, classroom reflections, a pop quiz, student writing, or a class survey. So let's see. You can choose as many of them as you would like to. You can choose other, because I'm sure there are plenty of other tools that you have used. Any option is great. So awesome. It looks like lots of you have used classroom reflection, so asking the students to say something like, today I learned, a verbal response to an ending question. Not as many have used exit slips, so we're going to talk about those in a minute, and class surveys as well. Okay, excellent job, guys. So let's talk more about that lovely exit slip, which some of you may have some questions about. As you can read on this slide, the exit slip is basically a piece of paper where a student writes an answer to a question or prompt from the teacher. The prompt is related to the lesson objective. So before the student leaves the class, he or she would write down an answer to a prompt and hand the exit slip to the teacher. This is like a ticket to leave the class that the student must buy or purchase by demonstrating what was learned that day. The teacher can then collect the exit slip from each student and can check each student's response to know whether the student learned the objective or not. So this can be a bit time-consuming, especially the first couple of times you try it. So I would recommend leaving about 15 minutes at the end of class the first time you try it. And depending on your group of students, their age, their level, that sort of thing, I would also recommend that you model or act out completing the exit slip and then walking out the door, handing it in before leaving. So once students have completed their answers, you can call them in groups or as individuals to exit the class as they hand out their exit slip. So some sample prompts or sentence starters you could give students are these. Write one thing you learned today. Or you could ask them to discuss how one thing we did in class today could be used in the real world. Or draw a picture of one vocabulary word we learned in class and write the corresponding word. Or, today we practiced the simple present tense or any other tense. Write one sentence using that tense that begins with the girl, blah, blah, blah. So there are lots of ways you can use an exit slip, and those ways include activities for high and low-level students. Let's take a look at some more prompts. So, like I said before, you could ask students to write one new word they learned that day and then draw a picture of it. Also, as I recommended, you could model doing this, especially for low-level students, before they try it on their own. Another example prompt is, do you agree or disagree with this statement? Perhaps you were studying how to agree or disagree on a certain social topic. You could ask higher level students to discuss whether they agree or disagree with something and to give a reason why. You could ask lower level students to simply write, I agree or I disagree. The third example here asks the question, what was one difference between the two articles that we read in class? This is obviously a higher level question for more advanced students. So these are all examples of different ways you could use exit slips in your classroom. There are plenty of other ways to do so, and I encourage you to try using these in your context for your classroom. They can be a very useful tool for providing direct evidence of learning. Okay, so let's continue our discussion of assessments by talking about rubrics. Raise your hand if you have used rubrics in your classroom before. A rubric is a tool for grading assignments based on criteria. We're going to get very specific on the next slide with rubrics, but basically a rubric is usually a piece of paper that the teacher creates. It often looks like a chart, table, or checklist. Rubrics show the students every detail of what they need to do in order to receive the best score possible on an assignment. And they leave no room for doubt about how a student can be successful on an assignment, paper, project, or any other learning task. Okay, so let's take a look at this blank rubric. I'm going to use this template to show you how I create a rubric. This rubric corresponds to one of our objectives from earlier, that students will write a paragraph about what they did on their summer vacations. So as you can see, this rubric needs a title, which I've added, which is usually the name of the assignment. Then there are spaces for categories, and then there are spaces for excellent, satisfactory, and unsatisfactory with corresponding points. So what do I mean by categories? Well, I mean the main parts of the assignment that I want to assess my students on. For example, the categories for these assignments would be topic sentence, supporting sentences, concluding sentence, vocabulary, grammar, and punctuation. I have chosen all of these categories because these are all areas that I want to assess for my students. I want to see if each of these components is an excellent component of their paragraphs or not. The idea here would be that I would have already taught all of these aspects, or that I would at least be addressing them in the lessons or series of lessons that I was teaching, so that my students could write great paragraphs about their summer vacations. As a teacher, you can choose any category that you think is appropriate for the assignments you give. This could be 1 category or 20 categories, depending on what you want your students to be able to do. Okay, so now that I have all of my categories, I want to write descriptions of what it would mean to achieve excellence in each category. So I'll start with those descriptors. So for the topic sentence, for a student to receive 3 points in this category, the topic sentence would need to clearly state the main idea and capture the reader's attention. The supporting sentences would all be relevant to the topic sentence and add interesting details. The concluding sentence would bring closure to the paragraph and restate the main idea. For vocabulary, I would ask students to add 4 to 5 new words correctly from what we had been recently studying. For grammar, I would check that there were 2 or fewer grammar mistakes that did not change the meaning of the sentences or paragraphs. For punctuation, I would require that there be no errors in punctuation or capitalization, like periods, question marks, commas, that sort of thing. So, as you can see, if a student received an excellent score in each category, that student would receive 100%, or a total of 18 points, 3 points for each of the 6 categories. When I graded each student's assignment, I would circle the boxes with the corresponding descriptions and come up with the student's total score. After writing the excellent descriptors, it becomes a little easier to write the descriptors for satisfactory or unsatisfactory. You don't have to say excellent, satisfactory, unsatisfactory. You can use whatever language you want for the criteria. You could even stop here and only write the top-level descriptors. This can sometimes be enough because if students have the top-level descriptors, they can see what they need to do and where they need to go to achieve a good score on this task. So I'm not going to read through each of the descriptors, but I will click through them here. Remember that you will have access to this presentation and other resources after today on the Ning. So as you can see, creating a rubric takes some work when you are initially writing it out. But once you have it as a tool, the grading process itself goes much more quickly and the scores on your students' assignments will be much more fair. All right, let's take a look at another rubric I created. So I created this one to grade paragraphs for a summary of a reading that my students would have done in class. Again, I have similar categories. I have the topic sentence, supporting details, clarity, cohesiveness, grammar, mechanics, but for this rubric, I have only the descriptors for what I am looking for the excellent score. And then I have a space where I can check or make comments under exceeds expectations, meets expectations, or does not meet expectations. This rubric would give a total possible score of 12 points and has some space for my comments on the bottom as well. So this is just another example. I just wanted to show you another way to write a rubric that might take a little bit less time. And next I want to show you some websites that I saw a few people mentioning in the chat box. So here we have 3 websites with tools for creating rubrics. The first one is Rubistar, which has many teacher-created rubrics that you can download and use for free depending on your assignment. It also has great tools for choosing categories and creating your own criteria for rubrics. It's a great site. I've used it tons of times. I really love that website. Another one is rubricsforteachers.com. This one also has many free rubrics that you can download for free. And the final site is an article from Edutopia about rubrics. So if you are new to using rubrics in your classroom and you just want to get a general guide for how to use them, that is a great article for your use. And again, you can find all of these websites on the Ning. So here are some general guidelines for using rubrics. So you want to keep the exact objective in mind when creating a rubric. Make sure that you are asking the students to demonstrate knowledge that you have taught and that is important for them to succeed in your class and to improve their English skills. Be as specific or general as you need to be. So if you're new to the world of rubrics, you could even start out with a smiley face, straight face, and frowny face as symbols to your students of excellent, satisfactory, and unsatisfactory. And then you could show models of what happy face, straight face, and frowny face look like. Or you can be as specific as the one that I demonstrated today in this webinar. It's up to you, your students, your time, your resources. Just the idea is to get closer and closer to as clear and specific of expectations as you can get. Number 3 is to share the rubric with the students before they begin working on the task. So make sure you give a copy of your rubric to your students or show them in some way how they will be graded so that they know what to do and how to achieve excellence on their assignment. Number 4, evaluate the students according to the rubric, making sure to be as objective as possible. So of course you have to use the rubric to grade your students' work. And number 5, refer to the rubric when students have questions about their scores. One of the great parts about rubrics is that they leave little room for doubt. If a student isn't happy with their grade, you can point them to the rubric and show them that the guidelines were clearly spelled out before students were given the assignment. Excuse me. So, I've gone into detail about 2 ways to assess students, exit slips and rubrics. What other ways do you have to assess your students? Please respond in the chat box. What other ways do you use? Direct observation, excellent. Comprehension checks, games, tests, quizzes, questions. Excellent. A checklist, role-playing. Excellent. Self-assessment. Fantastic. You guys are experts already. Yes, of course, we don't want to forget those quizzes and tests. Rubrics are usually used for projects or papers. So they're usually a little bit different than a test. Rubrics are usually used to grade someone's paragraph or someone's presentation, something like that. Okay, thank you so much. Oh, a portfolio, great idea. Okay, great answers. Thank you so much. Now that we have a clear destination in mind with an excellent objective and an excellent assessment, all we need to do is fill in the missing pieces by ordering our lesson activities so that our students succeed. So there are lots of terms for sequencing a lesson plan. One of those is scaffolding, which you might have heard of. You know how when a building is being constructed, The workers often place scaffolding on the sides to make sure the building stays up. And then when the building is strong enough to stand on its own, the workers take away the support and the building stands independently. This is our job for our students. Usually our students are not experts right away in a skill or piece of content knowledge. They need us to support them with the right order of teaching and activities so that they can become strong enough to stand on their own and so that they do not need our support anymore. Another term is gradual release of responsibility. This is similar to scaffolding in that it means that first, we offer a lot of support for our students, and by the end of our teaching of a certain skill, we gradually give all the responsibility to the student so that he or she is completing the task on his or her own. So, as you can see from the pictures here, we want to guide our students from dependence to independence. We might start by placing training wheels, like the first picture, of support for our students, but eventually we want them to be riding those bikes on their own, independently. So there are many ways to order a lesson, all of which, in my opinion, are the right way according to your context and situation on a given day. I saw lots of responses on the Ning earlier of different ways of ordering a lesson. Those are great. And I assume that many of you have learned several different ways to order a lesson. But today I'm going to discuss two that I have found useful and that I usually have in my mind when I'm writing a lesson plan and sequencing activities. Those two are Hunter's 7 steps and the I do, we do, you do model. So in Madeline Hunter's 7-step lesson, the teacher begins with an anticipatory set or a warm-up. This is just an activity to get the students ready for learning. It might be asking them to remember what they learned yesterday. It might be having them answer agree or disagree questions like I did at the beginning of this webinar. Any warm-up that gets students excited about and focused on the learning objective will do. The second step is to state the objective or purpose of the lesson. When students know why they are learning, they are much more likely to be motivated to learn and to participate in classroom activities. The third step is the instructional input component. This is when the teacher gives the students all that they need to be successful with the day's task. This might be explaining new vocabulary, showing a grammar construct, or explaining a new reading strategy, for example. Next is modeling. The teacher shows the students how to complete the task. Number 5 is to check for understanding. In this part of the lesson, you might ask comprehension questions or ask a student or students to re-explain what was taught and modeled in the very first couple of steps. Number 6 is guided practice. So for this, students might work in groups and get lots of feedback, and their first attempt at the skill would not be graded. And number 7 is independent practice. So students work alone to complete the task successfully. So I think that this model corresponds directly to that idea from the previous slide of a gradual release of responsibility or scaffolding. So with this model, students are definitely moving from dependence to independence. Another model I want to mention briefly is the I do, we do, you do model, which is actually very similar to Hunter's 7 steps minus the warm-up, which can always be added. As you can see from this slide, in this order model, the teacher first models the skill, then students work in pairs or groups on the skill with teacher feedback. Finally, students complete the activity on their own, usually referring to a rubric given to assess their learning. Okay, so let's try logical ordering together. So in the next few slides, I will model how I would order a lesson, and then you will order a lesson. So we're sort of doing an I do, we do situation, a little bit individual as well. So for this lesson that I will order, the objective is students will be able to write a logically ordered paragraph about a recently celebrated holiday with a topic sentence, supporting sentences, and concluding sentence. So here's my model of what I would do to scaffold this lesson. First, I would do a warm-up with my students to get them focused on the lesson objective by asking them to brainstorm what they did during a recent holiday or celebration that most of them would have experienced. I would probably write their ideas on the board so that students could have access to all of the ideas and vocabulary once they began to write. Then I would present my own excellent paragraph about my holiday and point out the topic sentence, supporting sentences, and concluding sentence. Next, I would ask students to work in pairs or groups to put a similar paragraph in order, making sure the topic sentence was first, then the supporting sentences, then the concluding sentence. And so students would have sentence strips and have to put them in order, and I could give them feedback, guided feedback, by walking around the room to check whether the order was correct or not. Finally, I would ask students to use the brainstormed activities from the warm-up to write a paragraph of their own. So I would use a rubric to grade their paragraphs based on correct ordering of ideas. All right. What do you think? Is that an okay lesson? Now it is your turn to order lesson activities. So for this activity, you are going to go to the polls in a second, but I'm going to read this objective first. So students will be able to use 5 simple past tense verbs in short presentations to describe their weekends. So now we have a bunch of activities, and I would like for you to put them in order. So the first one's easy because we don't have to order it, it's the warm-up. And that will be students drawing a picture of something they did over the weekend, just to be focused on the objective. So then I have A, B, C, and D. These are not in the correct order. And on the polls, I would like for you to check which order you think these should go in. So A says, students will work in pairs to change present tense verbs to past tense verbs within a paragraph. B, students write and then present their paragraphs. C, teacher shows an example of her own picture and explains her weekend, emphasizing past tense verbs. And D, students work in pairs to brainstorm a list of activities that they did over the weekend using past tense verbs. Okie dokie. So it looks like from the polls, everybody pretty much thinks that we should do C first. And I would definitely agree with you. C, teacher shows an example of her own picture and explains her weekend. So this is the modeling part, or the I do part, right? Then everybody pretty much agrees that second should be A, and I would also agree with you. Students work in pairs to change present tense verbs to past tense verbs within a paragraph. Okay, then we have a little bit of uncertainty about whether we should put B first or D first. So I would say we should probably put D first. This is where students are working in pairs to brainstorm a list of activities that they did over the weekend. So this is guided practice where students are still working in pairs. And then finally, B would be the last one. Students write and then present their paragraphs. So for me, I would say number 4 is a nice ordering of these events to scaffold learning that objective. Okay, so you can see how this order, in this order, the teacher models first, then the students have a couple of group activities to practice, and then finally they write their own paragraph. So I think this order definitely shows that gradual release of responsibility. Great job, everybody. So you can see that logical ordering is important, and that it is vital that we think through the steps we're going to lead our students through so that they can become independent users of the English language and they can master the skills that we teach them. So Now that we have talked about objectives, assessments, and the ordering of activities, we are finally ready for our last main point, reflecting on your lesson. Reflection is basically the practice of thinking about your teaching in order to find ways for improvement or refinement. We want to answer the general question, how do I know that my lesson was good? It's important to answer this question and to think about your teaching so that you can make steps to improve it. So here are some ways that we can reflect on our teaching practice. We can journal, writing our thoughts, ideas, and feelings about how our lessons went. We can take notes on the lesson plans that we make, jotting down ideas for how we would plan differently next time, or on what worked or what didn't. We can discuss ideas with our colleagues in the Teacher's Lounge. You can tell your colleague about an awesome activity that worked really well for your students, or get advice if an activity you created didn't work out so well. You can even ask your students what they think of the class and how they feel about their learning. This can be invaluable feedback if you want to ensure that their needs and desires are being met. Asking your students or giving your students a survey can be time-consuming, but whenever I have given my students a survey, it has really proven helpful for me to know what they think of the class and how I can proceed forward with those students. And then finally, you can analyze assessments. When you give students a test, project, or other task, you can consider what areas they did well in and what areas they faltered in. You can think about what points, skills, or concepts you might need to reteach, or what areas of confusion you could clear up. So here are some questions to guide you in your reflection process. You can ask yourself, what went well? What didn't go well? How did my students respond? How did my students do on the assessment? What would I have done differently? What will I do tomorrow? And how can I improve? So remember to always be honest with yourself when considering these questions about teaching. Because if you're not honest with yourself, there's no opportunity for change, right? So true improvement comes from recognizing those areas of growth, opportunity, and change. So those are some ways to reflect on your practice. Do you have other ways that you reflect on your lessons? Can you respond in the chat box to let everybody know what you do to reflect? What are some of your reflection practices? Good. So Lita journals. Excellent. Have a colleague come to your class and observe. That's a great idea. Observation. Excellent. Asking your students. Great. Sylvia from Mexico says a class video recording. I think that's a great idea. It can be kind of nerve-wracking the first time you're videotaped, but I think it's really great. You can kind of see things that you always do that you're not even aware of. That can really be a helpful tool for improvement. Action research, great idea. Exactly. A video, Yona from Tanzania, it does kind of depend. If you have the technology for it, great. If not, I think asking someone to come and observe your class is also excellent. Okay, thanks everybody. Great ideas. All right. So there are other items for consideration when lesson planning that we didn't really have time for today, but I urge you to talk with your colleagues about best practices for these areas as well. So I just wanted to acknowledge these other areas that I'm sure you have already considered for improving your lesson planning. You always want to have great warm-ups and motivational exercises. You want to be able to do transitions smoothly, so you want to be able to move smoothly from one activity to another without going crazy or without your students going crazy. You want to keep your students actively engaged with the material. We talked a little bit about logical sequencing today, but there are many other ways to think about this topic, and we just scratched the surface here. Number 5 is teacher talk versus student talk. In language classrooms, it's important to remember that we need to give our students as much of a chance to speak and practice communication in English as possible. So when lesson planning, it's always important to consider ways to decrease the time that you talk and to maximize the time students have to talk. So these are just other useful areas to consider and research on your own. And I encourage you to engage more in learning about these areas, or even to talk about some of these on the Ning later today or in the following weeks. Okay, so here's your exit slip. I want you to consider what you've learned today during this webinar. So please respond in the chat box to one or both of these questions. So what are the most important components of a lesson plan and why? That's the first question. And the second question is, how will your lesson planning change or be affected by what we discussed today? So if you would like to write this down first and then write in the chat box, feel free to do so. But I'm going to give you just a couple of minutes to respond in the chat box, and I'll try to acknowledge as many of you as I can. Asila from Pakistan says objectives and assessment are the most important components. And I see lots of other people that agree with her on that. Excellent. So lots of people agree with me and with some of the ideas I mentioned in this webinar, that the most important components of a lesson plan are the objective and the assessment, so that we can begin lesson planning with the end destination in mind, right? And it's also important to know that the students actually learn something, Andrea from Mexico said. So let's see, how will your lesson planning change or be affected by what we discussed today? So Sonia says she'll do more reflection. All right, I hope everyone out there in webinar land will join me, moderator Heather, in thanking our presenter Katie for that wonderful session. She really helped us figure out how to map our way to success in lesson planning and gave us some great ideas for writing clear, measurable, and attainable objectives, some good thoughts on sequencing and assessment, and also on reflection. And thank you all for your outstanding participation today. All right, now is the time you have all been waiting for, attendance. To enter your attendance information, we will need you to please enter your email address where it says Submit Attendance here on the lower left-hand side. If you're watching this webinar as an individual, we only need your email address. For viewing hosts, please submit your email address and the total number of teachers in your viewing group. You can see examples of how to submit your attendance information on the upper left-hand side of your screen. Again, all you need to do is enter this information, hit the enter key when you're done, and we will have your attendance information recorded. Okay, so course 15 is off to a great start with our webinar from Katie today. In 2 weeks, we look forward to seeing you all again on Wednesday, January 28th for our next session entitled Adapting Materials to Meet Your Classroom Needs. That webinar will be hosted by 2 of our regional English language officers, Russell Barzik and Roger Cohen. So we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you again for making this a great start to our new webinar course. We hope to see you in 2 weeks. The attendance pod will remain open for 30 minutes. Before the next webinar, we hope to see you all on our website, AmericanEnglish.ca.